Michael Harris was 58 years old, and he had long since grown used to the rhythm of winters in northern Montana, though this one already felt different. The local weather station had warned for days that a blizzard was on its way, the kind of storm that could shut down highways, bury cabins, and remind everyone who lived in the mountains that nature still ruled here. By late afternoon, the wind was already shaking the pine trees outside his cabin, and fine sheets of snow hissed across the clearing like ghostly waves. Inside, Michael tossed another split log onto the fire, watching sparks scatter before settling back into the crackle of orange flame. He wore his old flannel robe and thick socks, practical comforts against the draft that seemed to creep in no matter how much insulation he'd added over the years. His cabin sat on the edge of Flathead National Forest, a modest structure he had built himself 2 decades earlier, back when life felt fuller and less lonely. Before retirement, he had worked as a park ranger, a job that kept him outdoors most of the year, hiking trails, monitoring wildlife, and sometimes giving talks at the visitor center. The work had been tough but meaningful, and it had suited him until his wife Linda became ill. After she passed away 6 years ago, he left the service and retreated deeper into the wilderness, choosing quiet companionship with the mountains over the small town where everyone still looked at him with the kind of pity he couldn't bear. Tonight, as the storm gathered strength, Michael sat in his favorite armchair with a cup of coffee cooling in his hands. The cabin was quiet except for the wind howling against the eaves and the steady tick of the wall clock. He glanced at the digital thermometer by the window, 12 degrees F and dropping. He thought briefly of the elk herds he had tracked the previous fall, wondering how they endured nights like this, and then let the thought fade into the silence. This was the part of winter he had learned to accept, the long nights, the sound of the storm, and the kind of solitude that could feel both peaceful and heavy, depending on the moment. Still, there was comfort in routine. The fire, the coffee, the hum of the storm outside while he sat inside, grateful for shelter. Yet somewhere in the back of his mind lingered the sense that this storm might bring more than just snow and wind, though he couldn't have said why. The blizzard roared on, pressing against the cabin walls with a force that made the window panes tremble in their frames. Michael had just taken a sip of his lukewarm coffee when a sound reached him that didn't belong to the rhythm of the storm. At first, he thought it was just a branch snapping under the weight of the snow, but then it came again, 3 short thumps, muffled but distinct, right at the front door. He froze, the mug halfway to his lips, his eyes narrowing toward the entryway. Out here, 10 miles from the nearest paved road, no one knocked on your door in the middle of a blizzard. Neighbors rarely made surprise visits even in summer, and tonight the county road would be buried and impassable. A trickle of unease worked its way through his chest. Setting the mug on the table, Michael rose slowly, his socked feet making no sound on the wooden floor. The wind groaned through the trees outside, but beneath it he thought he heard something else, a faint sound almost like a cry or a whimper. He reached for the old Louisville slugger bat leaning against the wall by the door, a habit left over from years of living alone. Linda had always teased him about it, saying he was more likely to scare himself than fend off trouble, but tonight the feel of the worn wood in his hands brought a measure of steadiness. He waited a moment longer, listening, and then the sound came again. A soft scrape against the door, followed by a high-pitched yip that raised the hair on the back of his neck. Coyotes sometimes prowled the woods at night, but they never came this close to a house, especially not during a storm. Michael's pulse quickened. He turned the lock slowly, braced himself against the wind, and pulled the door open. Snow blasted in, stinging his face, and for a moment he could barely make out anything beyond the cone of light cast by the porch lamp. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw them. A coyote stood on the snow-covered mat, her fur plastered with ice, sides heaving with exhaustion. She was smaller than he expected, maybe 30 pounds, but unmistakably heavy with pregnancy. Pressed tight against her legs were 2 young pups, their spotted coats soaked and shivering violently in the brutal cold. Michael felt his breath catch in his throat. In all his years working as a ranger, he had never seen a wild coyote willingly approach a home, let alone bring her pups to the door. For an instant, instinct screamed at him to slam the door shut. Wild animals were unpredictable, and pregnant mothers could be dangerously protective, yet the coyote did not snarl or lunge. She simply stared up at him with eyes that carried something startlingly close to desperation, then gave a small, broken whine as one pup whimpered at her side. Michael gripped the bat a little tighter, his mind racing through every bit of training and instinct he still carried from his years in the field. Coyotes didn't ask for help, not from people. They stayed in the shadows, surviving on rabbits, voles, and whatever scraps nature allowed. Yet here she was, not snarling, not showing her teeth, just standing firm in the swirling snow with those pups pressed against her belly. The wind howled past them, driving ice into his face, and for a moment he hesitated, torn between fear and an odd, unexpected pull in his chest. "I must be crazy," he muttered under his breath. He took a step back, leaving the door open, the warm air rushing out to meet the cold. "All right, come in, but this is temporary, you hear me?" The coyote mother twitched her ears but did not move until he stepped back farther, lowering the bat but keeping it ready. Then cautiously she padded forward, her paws silent against the wooden floor as she crossed the threshold. The pup stumbled after her, collapsing almost immediately onto the thick rug in front of the fire. Michael's chest tightened when he realized it was the same rug Linda had chosen years ago, woven with deep reds and golds she said reminded her of autumn. The memory struck him hard enough to bring a sting to his eyes, but then one of the pups gave a pitiful little sneeze, shaking melted snow from its ears, and the moment turned oddly tender. He closed the door quickly, bracing against the gust that tried to tear it from his hands, and when the latch clicked shut, the cabin seemed to exhale. The storm still roared outside, but in here, in the glow of the fire, the scene looked almost unreal. The mother stayed on her feet, body curved protectively around her young, her golden eyes fixed on him. She didn't growl, but her gaze was sharp, as if warning him to keep his distance. Michael raised his free hands slowly, palm out. "Easy, girl, I don't want trouble." He set the bat back in its place against the wall and lowered himself into his armchair, careful not to move too fast. He'd learned long ago that animals could read intent, and the last thing he wanted was to spook her. The pups, however, paid him no mind. They curled closer to the fire, their shivering easing as warmth began to sink into their tiny bodies. One had a patch of white fur on its back that stood out against the tawny coat, the other had darker markings around its eyes that gave it a curious, almost mischievous look. Michael found himself whispering, "Snowcap and Scout, that'll do." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth, though it felt strange after so many quiet winters spent without reason to smile. He studied the mother more closely now. She was thinner than she should have been, her coat rough in places, and there was a slight limp in her right foreleg. Life out here had been hard on her, and by the way she kept her body between him and her pups, he could tell she had fought to keep them alive through the storm. "You've been through hell, haven't you?" he said softly. The coyote's ears flicked toward his voice, but she didn't back away. Instead, after a long moment, she lowered herself carefully onto the rug beside her pups, her body still taut with vigilance. For the first time since opening the door, Michael let out a slow breath. Against every bit of training and common sense, he had just invited the wild into his home, and somehow it felt less like a mistake than a strange kind of calling. The storm did not ease for the next 2 days. By morning, the drifts were waist high outside the windows, and Michael knew even if he wanted to drive into town, the county plow wouldn't reach his road for at least a week. Inside, the fire kept the cabin warm, and for the first time in years, he found himself moving about with a strange sense of purpose. He rummaged through the freezer and pulled out a package of venison he had set aside from last fall's hunt, thawing it in the microwave while 3 pairs of eyes followed his every step from the hearth. When he finally set the meat in a heavy ceramic bowl and placed it on the floor, the mother approached with caution. She sniffed, glanced at him once, then began to eat in quick, controlled bites. Only after she had eaten her fill did she step aside and let the pup scramble forward. Michael leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching them devour the food. He caught himself smiling again, something he hadn't done without forcing it since Linda's funeral. After they finished, the pups played briefly, clumsy in their new energy, while the mother stretched out near the fire, her eyes still never leaving him. It became a rhythm over the next several days. Thaw meat, refill a bowl of water, watch from a respectful distance. The pups grew more confident, venturing a little farther each day. Scout, the one with the dark eye markings, seemed especially curious, once dragging one of Michael's wool socks halfway across the room before collapsing in exhaustion on top of it. Snowcap, on the other hand, preferred to stay closer to his mother, often peeking from behind her legs as though the world was too big to face alone. Michael laughed quietly. The evening scout tried to climb onto the arm of his chair, tumbling backward when his tiny paws slipped. The sound startled him, the laugh, not the pup, for it had been so long since he'd heard his own voice break with amusement. Nights stretched on, but they felt less empty. He began noticing details he hadn't in years. The way the firelight caught the golden flecks in the mother's eyes, the way the pup's breathing softened into a steady rhythm once they were curled together on the rug. He found himself talking to them sometimes, nothing elaborate, just words to fill the silence. Linda would have liked you, he told them one evening, his voice low. She always said the wild deserved our respect, not our fear. The mother twitched her ears at his tone but didn't stir, her head resting on her paws. The storm outside howled, snow piling higher, but inside the cabin the air felt different, warmer, alive. Michael knew this couldn't last forever, knew common sense and every wildlife regulation would demand the animals return to the forest once the weather broke. Still, he couldn't deny the quiet comfort of having life move about the cabin again. It was as though the storm had delivered more than snow. It had brought him a reminder that even in the harshest winters, survival was possible and sometimes even shared. On the fourth night, just as Michael was dozing off in his armchair with a book slipping from his lap, a low growl rumbled through the room, deep and uneasy. His eyes snapped open, and he saw the mother coyote pacing in front of the fireplace, her movements restless, her sides heaving with every breath. The pups huddled together on the rug, wide-eyed, watching her with confusion. Michael's stomach tightened. He had seen this kind of behavior before during his years as a ranger. She was in labor. For a moment he simply sat there, frozen, uncertain of what to do. Instinct told him to keep his distance, but the sight of her circling, panting, searching for a place to settle pushed him into motion. He set his book aside, rose slowly, and crossed the room to a storage chest against the far wall. Inside were a few old wool blankets Linda had knitted years ago, packed away because he couldn't bring himself to use them after she passed. His hands hesitated over the fabric, memories flooding back, but then he carried the stack across the room and laid them carefully in the far corner, away from drafts and the flicker of the fire. He stepped back, giving her space. Here, he murmured quietly, this will do better than the floor. The coyote stopped pacing and turned toward him. For a long moment she stared, ears angled forward, body tense as if weighing his intention. Then with a soft whine, she crossed the room, nosed the blankets, and circled once before lowering herself onto them. Relief washed through Michael, though his pulse still hammered in his throat. He returned to his chair, keeping still, letting her work through what nature had already written into her body. Hours passed in heavy silence, broken only by the storm battering the cabin and the occasional high-pitched yelp from the mother. Michael kept watch, his hands clenched on the armrests, ready to call Dr. Carter if something went wrong, though he doubted she could reach them in this weather. Just before dawn, the first tiny cries pierced the quiet. He leaned forward, heart pounding, and saw three small, blind pups wriggling against their mother's belly. She licked them clean, nudging them gently into place to nurse, her movements both fierce and tender. Snowcap and Scout crept closer, curious, until she gave a sharp warning bark that sent them retreating to the rug. Michael let out a long, shaky breath, his shoulders easing for the first time in hours. Against all odds, in the middle of a storm that had cut him off from the rest of the world, his cabin had become a den. He sat back, exhausted but strangely alive, unable to look away from the fragile new lives stretching and squeaking in the corner. For years he had thought of his house as too quiet, too empty, but now the silence was broken by the sounds of survival, of life beginning. He whispered to himself, Linda, you'd have loved this. And though the coyote mother never lifted her gaze from her newborns, Michael could swear she understood. The blizzard finally eased, leaving the cabin buried in drifts that reached halfway up the windows, but inside the air carried a different weight. The cries of newborn pups mixed with the crackle of the fire, turning the silence that once haunted the place into something almost musical. Michael woke each morning to the sound of tiny squeaks and soft rustling from the corner where the mother nursed her litter. He kept his distance, moving carefully around the room, but the rhythm of care became second nature, thawing venison, replenishing the bowl of water, keeping the fire strong. The older pups adjusted quickly to their new role as siblings. Snowcap, cautious by nature, often sat near the nest watching the tiny pups with an almost protective gaze, while Scout couldn't resist testing boundaries. One afternoon Michael returned from fetching wood only to find Scout dragging his leather-work glove across the floor, head held high like a victorious hunter. That's not yours, Michael scolded gently, trying not to laugh as the little pup tripped over the oversized glove and tumbled in a heap. The sight made him chuckle out loud, a sound that startled even himself. It had been years since laughter came so easily. As the days passed, the mother grew stronger. The limp in her leg began to ease and her coat took on a healthier sheen. She never let down her guard completely. Her eyes still tracked Michael with quiet intensity, but there was a shift he could feel. The sharp line between wild and humans softened into something like tolerance, maybe even trust. At night, when the fire burned low, he often caught her watching him, not with suspicion but with a calm acknowledgement that they were, for now, sharing the same fragile roof against winter's grip. Michael found himself talking more, filling the space with words as though Linda were still there to hear them. He spoke about the trails he once patrolled as a ranger, about the tourists who thought they could outsmart the mountains and always needed rescuing, about the long drives home when Linda would have supper waiting. Sometimes he caught his voice breaking, but the pups didn't care. They sprawled out on the rug, bellies round, ears twitching in sleep, reminding him that even in loss there could be continuity. One night, as the wind rattled against the shutters, he whispered, "You saved me more than I saved you." The mother lifted her head at his voice, her amber eyes meeting his across the firelight. She didn't move, didn't make a sound, but in that moment he felt the truth of it. The storm outside had trapped them together, but it had also given him back something he thought he'd lost forever, the sense of being needed. It was near midnight when the storm found new strength. Michael had been drifting in and out of sleep in his chair when a violent gust slammed against the side of the cabin. The old window panes rattled, and before he could rise, the sharp crack of breaking glass split the air. Icy wind and a spray of snow burst into the room, scattering ash from the fireplace and plunging the cabin into chaos. The pups yelped in fright, scrambling toward their mother, who leapt up with a guttural snarl, positioning herself between them and the shattered window. Michael was on his feet instantly, heart hammering. Years of ranger instincts surged back. He grabbed the heavy wool blanket draped over the back of the chair and hurried to the window, pressing it hard against the jagged frame to block the worst of the wind. The cold cut straight through his robe, stinging his skin, but he forced the blanket into place, pinning it with a wooden chair until he could nail boards over it in the morning. Behind him, the coyote mother had not moved from her guard post. Her body was rigid, ears flattened, teeth bared at the storm as though she could fight it off by sheer will. The pups huddled beneath her belly, their small bodies trembling, their eyes wide with fear. For a tense moment, Michael and the animal shared the same role, protectors in the face of a common threat. When the blanket finally held, the worst of the wind died down inside the cabin, leaving only the eerie whistle through the cracks. Michael straightened slowly, his breath clouding in the freezing air. He turned toward the mother and found her eyes locked on him, not hostile but sharp, as if measuring his worth. "We're all right," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "They're safe." She gave a low chuff, something between a growl and a sigh, then lowered herself to the rug, curling around her pups. The tension in the room eased, though the storm outside raged on. Michael fetched another log for the fire, coaxing the flames back to life, then sat again, wrapping his arms around himself as the adrenaline drained away. His chest still thudded with the echo of danger, but beneath it was something else, a flicker of connection, of solidarity. He glanced at the blankets in the corner where the newborns slept and realized the cabin had become more than a shelter. It was a battlefield against winter, and for the first time in years, he wasn't fighting it alone. The storm finally broke after nearly a week, leaving the mountains buried under a dazzling crust of white. The sky cleared to a sharp, cold blue, and sunlight glittered off the snowdrifts stacked against the cabin walls. Michael had just stepped outside to shovel a narrow path from the porch when the crunch of boots startled him. He looked up to see his neighbor, Tom Whitaker, trudging toward him with a rifle slung across his shoulder. Tom lived 3 miles down the road, a retired logger built thick as an oak stump, the kind of man who believed anything that walked on 4 legs was fair game if it came too close to human homes. "Morning, Mike," Tom called, his breath puffing in the frozen air. "Heard the storm hit you hard, thought I'd check in." Michael forced a smile, gripping the shovel tighter. "I managed." Cabin held up mostly. Tom's sharp eyes scanned the yard, then dropped to the snow at his feet. He crouched, brushing at a series of paw prints that led straight to the porch. "Coyotes," he muttered, his tone sour. "Whole pack by the looks of it. You've been feeding them." Michael's chest tightened. He knew lying outright would only fuel suspicion, but admitting the truth was out of the question. "Strays passing through, probably looking for scraps," he said evenly. Storm drove everything closer. Tom stood, frowning. "Dangerous business. Coyotes'll take your chickens, your dogs, hell, I've seen them get bold enough to nose around barns. If I were you, I'd call fish and wildlife before you've got a real problem." His gaze lingered on the porch as though he expected something to move behind the door. Michael kept his face calm, though inside he felt the weight of the cabin pressing down on him. He pictured Snowcap and Scout curled by the fire, the newborn pups nursing, the mother watching with those wary amber eyes. The thought of Tom discovering them sent a cold shiver down his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. "I'll keep an eye out," he said, his voice steady. Tom gave a short grunt and shifted his rifle on his shoulder. Don't let them get too close, Mike. Folks around here don't have patience for predators near their homes. With that, he turned and trudged back into the snow, leaving behind a trail of boot prints that cut across the pristine yard. Michael stood there until Tom's figure disappeared behind the trees, then exhaled slowly, his breath clouding in the crisp air. He turned back toward the cabin, his heart still pounding. Inside, the coyotes were silent, as if they too sensed the danger that had just brushed past them. Michael rested a hand on the doorframe and whispered, "We're going to have to be careful now." The storm had tested their bond, but this was something else entirely. 2 days after Tom's unexpected visit, Michael knew he couldn't put it off any longer. The pups were growing restless, especially Scout, who had discovered the joy of pouncing on shadows and trying to climb the furniture. Even Snowcap had begun to test his courage, wandering farther from the hearth with each passing day. And the newborns were gaining strength fast, their squeaks louder, their wobbly legs carrying them short distances before tumbling over. The cabin was no longer just a shelter, it was beginning to feel like a cage. That morning, Michael picked up his phone and called Dr. Emily Carter, a wildlife veterinarian he had worked with during his ranger days. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished, she let out a low whistle. "You've got yourself into something extraordinary, Mike," she said. "But you're right, if they stay inside much longer, you'll risk domesticating them. We need to start the transition." By afternoon, Emily's old pickup crunched up the icy drive, loaded with lumber, chicken wire, and a few weathered tarps. Together, they trudged through the snow to a spot just behind the cabin, where the trees formed a natural windbreak. "We'll build an enclosure here," Emily said, pulling on her work gloves. "Big enough for climbing and running, but secure. Think of it as training wheels for the wild." For hours, they worked side by side, hammering boards and stretching wire until their hands ached from the cold. Michael hadn't done this kind of labor in years, but the rhythm of it felt good, almost grounding. By dusk, they had built a pen nearly 30 feet long, with logs stacked for climbing, platforms at different heights, and small shelters lined with straw to mimic natural dens. A narrow dog door, cut through the back wall of the cabin, connected the enclosure to the living room. When it was finally ready, Michael opened the flap and stepped back. At first, nothing happened. Then Scout poked his head through, ears twitching at the sense of open air. With a delighted yip, he bounded outside, nose to the snow, tail wagging like a pup who had just discovered freedom. Snowcap followed more hesitantly, sniffing each step, while the mother padded out silently, her amber eyes scanning the trees with instinctive precision. Even the newborns squirmed in curiosity, though they stayed close to her belly. Michael watched from the doorway, his breath fogging in the cold, as the small family explored their new world. Scout leapt clumsily onto a log, sliding back down with a thud that made Michael chuckle. Snowcap sniffed at the straw shelter before curling up inside as if testing its comfort. The mother prowled the perimeter, testing every inch of the wire, her movements fluid and alert. Emily stood beside him, her expression a mix of wonder and disbelief. "They're adjusting faster than I expected," she said softly. Michael nodded, though his chest ached. He knew this was the first step toward letting them go, and the thought of an empty cabin made him uneasy. Still, watching Scout tumble joyfully in the snow, he understood it was the only way. The wild had asked for sanctuary, but it had never meant to stay. Spring crept into the mountains slowly, melting the deep snowdrifts into rivulets that trickled through the pines. The air still held a bite of cold, but the meadows had begun to show patches of green. By then the pups were stronger, their legs steady, their curiosity boundless. Scout could scale the highest log in the enclosure with triumphant yips, while Snowcap had grown into a careful observer, keeping watch whenever the younger litter tumbled through the straw shelters. The mother had regained her strength as well, her coat sleek, her movements sharp and confident. She was no longer the desperate animal who had appeared on Michael's porch that stormy night. She was wild again and ready. Emily returned one crisp morning with her truck and a set of transport crates. Michael's stomach knotted at the sight of them. They worked together in silence, setting the crates in a line and placing meat inside to coax the coyotes in. To his surprise, the process went smoothly. The mother stepped inside first, calm and deliberate, as though she understood what was happening. The pups followed, Scout bounding in with eagerness, Snowcap pausing for a long moment before finally slipping inside. The younger ones needed gentle nudging, but soon all were secured. The drive took over an hour, winding through mountain roads to a remote valley Michael had helped scout during his ranger days. It was the kind of place he trusted, plenty of prey, rocky ledges for dens, streams for water, and miles of forest stretching beyond. When they arrived, the sun was just cresting the ridgeline, painting the meadow gold. Michael and Emily positioned the crates side by side, then stepped back. On Emily's signal, they opened the doors. For a heartbeat, nothing moved. Then the mother emerged, her body low, scanning the open space with fierce precision. Scout bounded out right behind her, leaping into the grass with pure joy. Snowcap followed more cautiously, circling back once as if to reassure himself. One by one, the younger pups spilled into the light, tumbling into the meadow like children set free from school. The family gathered together at the edge of the clearing. The mother raised her head, ears flicking, nose lifted to the breeze. Then she turned, her amber eyes locked with Michael's across the distance. For a long moment, the noise of the forest fell away, leaving only the steady thrum of his heart. She gave a single, sharp yip, the same sound she had made on his porch that first desperate night. Then, with a flick of her tail, she led her family into the trees. Michael stood rooted in place, watching until the last flash of tawny fur disappeared into the undergrowth. His throat burned and his vision blurred, but he couldn't help the small, bittersweet smile that tugged at his lips. Emily touched his shoulder gently. "They'll be all right," she said. "You gave them a chance most never get," he nodded, swallowing hard. "They gave me one too." The cabin felt different after the release. For the first time in weeks, the rug by the fire lay empty, the corners free of paw prints, the silence stretching long and unbroken. Yet it wasn't the same silence that used to weigh on Michael after Linda's passing. Now it carried echoes, Scout's clumsy tumbles, Snowcap's cautious stares, the soft squeaks of newborn pups. Every corner of the house seemed to hold a memory, and instead of loneliness, he felt a quiet gratitude. He spent the next days mending the window from the storm, organizing the photographs he had taken, and writing notes about the family's growth. Emily had suggested publishing them, perhaps in a wildlife journal, but Michael thought more about keeping them as a record, a reminder of what trust between man and nature could look like. On cold nights, he sometimes left the dog door unlatched, a habit he couldn't quite break. Most evenings nothing happened, but once or twice he thought he heard movement outside, a soft rustle, a fleeting shadow at the tree line. And on one clear night, as the moon rose over the ridge, he swore he heard a coyote's long, familiar call drifting down the valley. Whether it was Grace and her pups or just another family, he couldn't say, but the sound filled him with a warmth that carried him through the empty spaces of the cabin. Standing by the window, coffee in hand, he whispered into the night, "You'll always have a place here." The mountains answered only with wind, but he no longer felt alone. The wild had asked him for sanctuary, and in giving it, he had found his own. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to give this video a thumbs up. Share it with a friend who loves stories about the bond between humans and nature. And let me know in the comments, have you ever had an encounter with wildlife that left a lasting impression? For more inspiring stories like this, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell so you won't miss the next one.